Welcome to 132 Problems Revisiting Mormon Polygamy. This episode requires a bit of an introduction. I have been working so hard on the response videos I've been doing to the contemporaneous evidence that has been presented, and my next episode will be coming out next week on that. In the meantime, I thought it would be useful to share this conversation. I was really excited to have this conversation with Jim Bennett. I was told by various people that we should have a conversation, so I was excited to do that. I did not expect the conversation to take some of the turns it did. I was not planning on a conversation that touched on political issues, and I was worried that maybe I wouldn't be able to use this. But many of you know Karen, my editor, and she watched it and she said she actually loved the conversation because what it represented was two people who view the world very differently, from just a huge ideological divide, coming together and doing their best to respectfully engage in conversation. And we kind of thought, here we are right after the election that's, created some strong feelings, and going into the holidays where we will be visiting with people possibly who see the world differently than we do as we are gathering with family. And we thought maybe it would be a good idea to let us all kind of get a preview of how these conversations can be had. I think that while I didn't expect the conversation to go this direction, and I'm expecting that some of you might feel some tension rising from various perspectives when you hear things say that you don't agree with, whichever side you tend to lean more toward, Jim or me. I'm hoping that it will be worth it and that you will enjoy the conversation and being able to, I think that maybe it's good for us to get more comfortable with those feelings. That's what I was going to say. Hopefully we can all start going, I can handle this. I can handle having my worldview challenged and engaging with someone who has a completely different worldview. So that's what I am hoping for. I do want to say from the beginning that the day after this conversation, I went on Jim's podcast, and actually he and Ian and I had a fantastic conversation that I should be able to link to. So look for that in the description. So you can listen to that one if you want to talk, if you want something that's a little bit more of a feel-good conversation that focuses more on polygamy than this one was able to do. But with all of that being said, I think this was a valuable conversation. I am happy to say that I consider Jim a friend. I'm really glad that we connected. We are looking forward to future conversations. So the moral of the story is hang in there. Don't write people off and don't give up, because it is important that we learn to have these difficult conversations and that we learn to have relationships even when there are very big differences in perspectives. With all of that being said, thank you for joining me, and here's the episode. Welcome to this conversation. I am excited to be here with Jim Bennett, who I am meeting for the first time, along with many of you, I guess those of you who don't already know Jim. But I had some listeners reach out to me and tell me, you need to call Jim Bennett. So I went ahead and reached out to him, and I'm really glad I did. We were able to put something together, and I'm really excited, Jim, to let you kind of share your story and then discuss some of the things that we sort of have in common and see the same ways, and see what we can navigate there. So welcome to the program. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. And I'm very glad that you did reach out, and it's very nice to meet you and to have this conversation. I am a lifelong member of the church. I live in Sandy, Utah. I am married with 5 children. I'm a member of the Tabernacle Choir at Temple Square. I joined in 2019. And then after about 8 months, the choir shut down for COVID for 18 months. So even though I've been in the choir for 5 years, it doesn't feel like it's been that long. But that's currently how I'm participating in the church. I've checked all the boxes. I served a mission to Scotland way back when. And same as my father. My father also served as, I met a bishop who was baptized by my father when this bishop was 8 years old.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And, I've been a believing active Latter-day Saint my entire life. I sort of came into prominence in this sort of space. I mean, people want to talk to me on podcasts now because I wrote a lengthy reply to the CES letter. And I think we'll probably discuss some of that here today. But that's kind of what I've been best known for. But then I've also it's been interesting because after I wrote my reply to the CES letter, I started going on podcasts to talk about it. And one of the first ones was somebody said, I'd really like to see you go toe to toe with Bill Reel.
Oh, okay.
And I didn't know who Bill Reel was. And
Yep.
I said, I'm not going toe to toe with anybody, but I am happy to talk to anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And so we actually recorded about 14 hours of conversations. And I'm amazed at how many people came and said, I've listened to the whole thing. And I thought, what kind of glutton for punishment are you? I haven't listened to the whole thing.
Do you know what? People are so interested in these topics. I think that's great that, I'll bet that that's a fantastic conversation. I guess I've unintentionally gone toe to toe with Bill Reel. I didn't really want to have a debate with him. I just wanted a conversation, but it kind of turned more into a debate. I don't know. But I'll bet you had better conversations with him than I did, I hope.
Well, I was actually kind of frustrated at the end of it because he went around and said, look, I won my debate with Jim Bennett.
Yeah.
And I was like, this wasn't a debate, and you've made it harder for people to have this kind of a conversation.
Right.
But what was interesting, that was sort of a turning point because suddenly, I've gotten a whole lot of emails and messages and just kind comments from people saying your CES letter reply has really helped me and helped me stay in the church. But after Bill Reel, I started to get messages from people who have left the church. And the messages said things along the lines of, you didn't persuade me to come back to church. You didn't persuade me the church is still true, but you helped me appreciate and understand my family and friends who are still in. And that sort of has introduced me into a really interesting space. We talked about this offline. You referred to this as sort of the borderlands of the church. There are so many people who have left, but still are connected, whether they want to be or not. And often it's because they have family who are still in. Very often it's a mixed faith marriage where a spouse is still in. And so you have people that are in this kind of space that the church doesn't really recognize. The church, I have not heard anything from church leaders talking about how to navigate a mixed faith marriage.
Yeah.
There are sort of passing references to continue to love your children if they leave. But people in those borderlands don't really, we as people on the inside, as active members of the church, we really don't fully understand or have the kinds of tools necessary to reach out to them, to stay connected to them.
Right.
And since that Bill Reel conversation, I then went and had another 14 hours of conversations with John DeLynn.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I had a number of conversations. I've had conversations with Radio Free Mormon and other people outside the church, but I've also gone on Ward Radio. And, I'm willing to talk to anybody.
That's great.
But where I sort of find myself now is that people outside the church, particularly people in those borderlands, are the people that seem to respond to what I'm saying a whole lot more positively than a lot of the people inside the church. I have been harassed and just, there was an account on Twitter that got mad about something I had posted, and they said, call the Tabernacle Choir and tell them to get rid of their apostate.
Yeah,
and
lovely.
The phone number for the choir. And I was like, and so I called that phone number because I know the person who's going to answer that phone. This is a person that was she was a member of the choir, and you're not allowed to sing in the choir and work for the choir at the same time. So she's taken a hiatus from singing in the choir so that she can work for the choir. And I called her and I said, has anybody called you and told you that Jim Bennett needs to be kicked out of the choir? And she said, no. Why would they do that? And I said, well, here's this Twitter account that's doing this. And she looked at it and she said, oh my goodness, this is the most awful thing I've ever seen. Would you mind if I brought this to the attention of church security?
Oh, wow.
And I said,
wow.
No, please do. And within 2 hours, that account was suspended. And
Okay.
so I don't know who at church security has ins with Elon Musk's
Well,
inner circle.
in one way, that's like encouraging. In another way, it's terrifying.
It's a little bit, yeah, it's a little bit of both.
I think it's mostly terrifying to me because, oh, okay, all right.
Well, the thing is, I found so that there is a contingent of members of the church, particularly online and in social media, that I find really terrifying.
Yeah.
Because their goal is a smaller church.
Yes. In fact, when you talked about them posting, I think we have some trolls in common, shall I say? And these efforts to punish people for thought crime, for bad belief and to get, like, there are actual efforts. I haven't made this public because I didn't want to, but I recently had a new stake president called, and the word that I was getting a new stake president got out, someone in my stake or adjacent to my stake, and gave out the information. And that poor brand new stake president, one of the first things he had to deal with was being inundated with calls for discipline. I just find it to be absolutely appalling. After all of the efforts that we put into missionary work, to sending our kids out to bring them to the gospel, if you have a disagreement, then we want you gone. If you dare speak about something that you disagree on, I find it to be just so in complete opposition to what we ideally would be about as disciples of Christ and as members of the Church of Jesus Christ and people who believe in the gospel. So I have a couple of questions I want to ask you. You brought up so many things. So I want to go clear back to the beginning. I want to ask about the Tabernacle Choir. So does that count as your church calling? Are you given a calling in addition, or is that pretty much your calling while you're in it?
That is my calling. I have been called and set apart as a musical missionary, is the title.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and they're not allowed to give me, I'm not sure what the term is. I keep thinking it's something along the lines of calling of significance. For instance,
Okay.
I have been called, I am a seminary substitute teacher.
Okay.
But I'm not allowed to be called into something that requires a significant contribution of time outside of the choir.
Okay, that's good to know. And then I do want to know, what made you think I want to join the choir? Have you been trying? Have you tried before? Was it I have more time now, and you've always sung? I wanted to kind of know your story.
Yeah. Well, music has always been a big part of my life. I was a theater major at the University of Southern California growing up.
Okay.
And,
I majored in musical theater at BYU, music dance theater. So we've got that in common.
I probably know a lot of, Tim Threlfall.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, because I was the artistic director at Tuacahn for about 5 years.
Yes, you probably know a lot of them. Mm-hmm.
So that whole circle, I think that was 20 years ago. So
yeah, I don't know if Becky Wright Phillips is still there. Gail Lockwood was there when I was there.
Gail Lockwood, I know Gail Lockwood.
Yep. So anyway.
Sure. So I was going to be a world famous actor, but I ended up getting into arts management. I ran a theater in Jackson Hole, Wyoming for 5 years, and then I was at Tuacahn for about 5 years. And I have just always, music has been a huge part of my life. And I was dabbling a little bit in auditioning for theater again.
Oh, okay.
And, I was writing a column. I was writing an arts column for the Deseret News. And I thought it would be fun to audition for a show as part of a column. I had no idea that they would cast me, but they did, much to my wife's chagrin, because I didn't tell her I was auditioning. That's a long, messy story. But that was about 10 years ago. And I was really kind of enjoying that and dabbling. I was up at Pioneer Theater Company, and I did several shows up there. And when my kids, I've got 5 kids, and my youngest was about ready to, I guess they were still in high school, but 4 out of 5 of my kids had left home. And my wife said to me, and there was a guy in the choir that was in our ward.
Okay.
And it's not like it was a lifelong ambition for me, but this guy was talking about it, and I went, that sounds like that would be kind of fun. And he says, well, if you want to audition, you better do it soon, because the rules are you can stay in the choir for 20 years or until you turn 60.
Right.
And I am now 56 years old.
Okay.
You can't audition for the choir after the age of 55.
Oh, okay.
So I was 50 at the time when I auditioned, but my wife said to me, the kids are gone. You could probably do this. We could probably, because one of the difficulties of doing theater and doing all this sort of stuff on the side, it just takes an awful lot of time. Yeah. And when you've got kids at home and you're shuttling them to soccer games and everything else,
it's hard to get to your own rehearsals and tech week.
It's hard to devote that kind of time to the choir, but the time seemed to be right. And I went, okay, well, I think this would be fun. And so I looked up how to do it. And the first thing you had to do in 2019 was send in a CD, which was already antiquated technology back then. So I had to burn a CD, and I didn't have a CD player. And so I played it. My daughter had a CD changer in her car. And so I played my audition after I burned it. I wanted to listen to it. And I went, okay, this is okay. And I listened to it. And then I sent it in. And then a few days later, my daughter called me and said, hey, Dad, I was listening to your audition in the car. You sounded great. I'm sure you're going to get in. And I went, well, wait a minute. If you listen to my CD in the car.
What did you send them?
What did I send them? And it turns out what I sent them was my daughter's mix CD. And the first song on it was Kiss by Prince. So I'm imagining Mac Wilberg and Ryan Murphy cranking up the CD player and let's see what Jim Bennett sounds like. And they hear, you don't have to be rich to be my girl. So the choir was very gracious, was very kind. They called, they said, we think you sent us the wrong CD. And I said, yes, I have. And I'm very sorry. And they said, well, you could just send us an audio file. And now that's what we do.
Why didn't they just do that in the first place? That would have been much easier. Well,
it takes them, I guess, a little while to catch up with technology, but
yeah.
But so it's a 3-step process. I sent in that audition, and then you take a written exam that's really what I've heard is that's the big hurdle that weeds out a lot of the.
Is it music theory? Is that what they're
music theory? But it's actually a lot of oral training, AURAL training. They'll play you a musical phrase, and then they'll play a second musical phrase that's nearly identical and say which note changed. It's that kind of thing.
Yep.
And I was able to get through that. And then the third thing is the live audition in front of Mac Wilberg, in front of Ryan Murphy. And that was absolutely terrifying. They just sort of hand you a piece of music and say, sing this. And there's no accompaniment, no anything. And so I was like, oh, okay. And I remember doing it and having Mac Wilberg just say, no, that's not it. And I just thought, crud, I'm doomed. And I came out of the audition, and I was looking for some kind of sympathy. And the gatekeeper, the woman that was just outside the door, I said, boy, I really think I screwed up in there. And she looked at me and she said, well, it is very hard. Well, thanks. That makes me feel a whole lot better. But I don't know if they were just short on men that year or whatever it was.
Oh, I'll bet you were great. Mac Wilberg's fun. I sang in one of Mac Wilberg's choirs at BYU before he went to the Tabernacle, and he's fabulous. Yeah, I was happy to see him. Yeah. So, okay, thanks for filling us in with all of that. And now I want to ask you about the CES letter. What made you decide to take that on? And tell us a little bit about the process of writing your response and the time you put into it, how long it is, where people can find it. Just give us all of the lowdown on that process and that final product.
So when I was 18 years old, I was a freshman at the University of Southern California, and I was in the dormitories with an evangelical Christian as a roommate. And we had long, messy theological discussions that seemed kind of ridiculous to me now, but they got very heated on occasion. And at one point, I went to the USC library and I checked out a copy of The God Makers.
Oh, okay.
Which was the big anti-Mormon book at the time. It was a book and a movie.
I thought it was a movie. It was a little before my time. I just remember it, but I remember hearing about it, but I didn't know anything about it.
Yeah, it's known, and you can still find clips of it, particularly that animated clip about God having endless celestial sex and
knocking on Mary's door and looking around. Yeah.
I mean, that's still online, but this was the book, which went into more detail. And that was sort of my version of the CES letter. I read that and it just shook me to my core.
Okay.
And I thought, what am I going to do? How do I stay? And that's the thing that people don't realize, is that people who read the CES letter, people who find out things about church history that they find disconcerting, their first instinct is not, oh, okay, great, now I can leave, and
no,
now I can go sin. It was, geez, how do I stay? How do I stay knowing all these things?
Yes.
And I had the benefit of having a father who was knowledgeable about these things and also patient and kind enough to sort of walk through them with me.
Okay.
And I also at the time was living in the house of my uncle, Howard Anderson, who was the president of the Los Angeles Stake at the time. And he was the same way. He was like, oh, okay, well, you have a concern about this, and let's talk about this.
Wow.
And I went home for Christmas, and the Elders Quorum gave out copies. I now wonder if maybe my father had cued them to do this, but they gave out copies of a book called The Truth About the Godmakers that essentially went line by line through the Godmakers book and said, well, here's a different perspective. And the thing that was so helpful about that was not, oh, okay, here are all the answers. It was, well, gee, somebody intelligent with integrity was able to look at these issues and they were able to stay.
Yes.
This is how they did it. And it sort of put a brake on my panic. It gave me enough time to say, okay, well, maybe I don't have to leave right now. Maybe I can work through these. And so that was really instrumental in my staying. And so that's all precursor so there were family members who had left because of the CES letter.
Okay.
And I started seeing all of the chatter about the CES letter online, and I thought, geez, this must be the most devastating indictment of the church that's ever been written. And I felt like I had no choice but to read it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the things I really feel strongly about is that I don't feel that the church has any choice but to confront all of these things head on, because our approach as a church has been to sort of bury our heads in the sand and tell everybody, just don't look at it, don't pay attention to it. And that just doesn't work anymore. I don't know.
There's too much information. And actually, I've come to see the opposition in most things as a gift to us, right?
Yeah.
Like that's what marriage is supposed to be, right? It's a man and a woman in order to exert the perfect amount of equal opposition to one another to help us be our best, and to in both directions, the assistance and the friction, right? And I really think that that the critics of most things, the critics of the church, or I feel like I'm a critic of the historical narrative in some areas, right? That we need to take those voices very seriously, because they're gifts to us. Just like as a parent, you sometimes learn your hardest kid is your greatest gift, right? And that's anyway, I completely agree with you. There's so much for us to learn, to delve into and realize, we're wrong on this. We need to rethink this, or, we're really solid on this and this is important. I just think it's important to dig in for a multitude of reasons, not only to preserve faith, but also to come to greater truth. Because the fact is, our critics have points to make, right? There are things that have been incorrect, for sure, and still are. So anyway, I'll let you continue. But yes, I completely agree with you on that.
No, I appreciate that. I think that's exactly right. So when I read the CES letter, I got Godmaker's flashbacks.
Yeah, sure.
Because there's nothing in the CES letter. There's nothing in there that's particularly new. All of these arguments have been around for a very long time.
That's important for people to hear. I think I kind of had it in my brain that some of these things that we're grappling with now are new, but you're right. Like there really isn't much new. It was all written at the very beginning by the detractors, by the Joseph Jacksons and the Dr. Wiles in the very beginning of the church, right? So, okay, that's a good thing to recognize.
Yeah, and so at that point, we were in the age of bloggers.
Yeah,
that doesn't seem to be a thing anymore. But back then, I had been maintaining a blog for about 10 years, and my blog was things. It was things about the church, but it was also political. It was also pop culture. It was just whatever came into my mind. I just felt like I wanted an outlet to write all this stuff down. And as I read the CES letter, I would come to sections and say, "Oh, I wrote something about that on my blog. Oh, I've talked about this before." And so what I started doing, I didn't really set out to line by line the CES letter, but what I started doing was cutting and pasting pieces of my blog into responses to the CES letter. And then I reached a point where I thought, well, I've got to go all the way with this, in for a penny, in for a pound. And I also felt like I was sort of paying forward the truth about the God makers, that had been so helpful to me. And I didn't see anything out there that was approaching the CES letter in the same way. So I went through the CES letter line by line.
Wow.
And responded to it. Because one of the things that Jeremy Runnels kept saying was, nobody's ever responded to this. I've written this and nobody's ever responded to it. And one of the challenges of responding to it, at least in the kind of detail that is necessary to really respond to every single one of his concerns, is that the CES letter is 80 pages long.
Right. And ever changing.
And
right?
never changed.
It's really long and it's never settled. Yeah.
Right. So I wrote a version of a reply in 2016, and then I rewrote it, and I'd say about at least half of it was all new material in 2018. I haven't revisited it since then. I don't know that I will. I don't know how much Jeremy has changed it since then. But he has a section on his webpage where he debunks the debunkers.
Oh, okay. Uh-huh.
And forever he didn't debunk me. He just he would say, nobody's ever responded to my CES letter. And then people would say to him, well, Jim Bennett has. And I watched a friend of mine say that on his Facebook page and see him get banned in real time.
Wow. Okay. Isn't it interesting? It's so interesting to me how hard it is to not become what you decry, right? Like here they are decrying the hiding and the falsehood and the not honest engagement, and it's really hard for them not to just do the same thing. A lot of these big podcasters, like the only reason that they have not had me on their shows, which they absolutely should, is because they don't want to, well, in one of their words, they don't want to give any oxygen to the perspective that I feel I have very solid evidence to argue. And so it's really interesting to see them doing exactly the same thing. And that's just another example of it. They say they just want honesty and transparency and integrity, but then they get to see when the shoe's on the other foot, they don't really do it that well themselves. I find that interesting.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because my relationship with Jeremy Runnels, it has been an interesting sort of, when I first wrote the CES letter reply, I had never met him. I didn't know anything about him. And I was just trying to respond to the arguments. I wasn't really engaging him. And after I did my Bill Reel conversations, I got an email from him saying, "Oh, Jim, you made an absolute fool of yourself, and you've given me all the rope I need to hang you." And we exchanged these sort of nasty emails. And then I finally said, look, this is one of the first things I said was, look, you realize we're the only ones reading this, right? I mean, you're not posting this anywhere. So you can tone it down a little bit, and we can actually just talk and without he would send little gifts and little, it's like,
you're not performing for anybody right now.
We're not performing for anybody. And then finally I said, look, wouldn't this be more fun over burgers? I'm buying.
Oh, that's nice.
And we went to lunch, and I think I made a friend. I thought he was a really delightful guy, and without all of the bluster and everything else, that was one of the first times I realized, okay, we haven't been doing this right. We haven't been engaging, demonizing Jeremy Runnels, demonizing the critics of the church. It doesn't help anybody. It doesn't build anybody's faith, and it doesn't work. And so he said, I'm going to now do a debunking of you, and but I'm going to give you whatever you write. I'll put that on my site too.
Okay.
And I started to read his debunking, and then I started, okay, well, I'll do a line by line on his debunking of my debunking of his debunking of.
It's debunking inception. It's never going to end.
Yeah, it felt like it felt like I was reading the fine print on a mortgage loan.
Yeah.
It was just, this is so reductive. This is so, so what I wrote was this sort of broad response to just, because basically the theme of his debunking of my debunking is that Jim Bennett is not talking about chapel Mormonism or real Mormonism. He's talking about
his definition.
Jim Bennett, he had this little logo, Jim Bennett Mormonism, with a little trademark in the corner of it. And my broad response was, you're absolutely right. This is Jim Bennett Mormonism. Where you are wrong is in thinking that there is some kind of chapel Mormonism, pure Mormonism, real Mormonism that exists independent of every individual's interpretation of it. Every single member of the church lives their own version of the restored.
I love it.
Every single one of us.
That's exactly right. And we're all allowed to adjust when, just like he constantly adjusts the CES letter, wouldn't we hope that our people are adjusting their ideas?
Well, sure. I mean, it's my reply. The reason I think my reply has been helpful, and it was interesting because a few years back, I was invited to Book of Mormon Central, which is now Scripture Central. Mm-hmm. They invited me to lunch, and they met with me and they said, we've just come out of a meeting with the secretary of the Quorum of the 12. And they have shared with us the statistics of how many people the CES letter has driven out of the church. And they have done extensive research to determine, and they said, and the number is huge. And they said they would share the numbers with me, and they never have. So I should probably go back and see if I can get those numbers. But they said they've done extensive research to determine what mitigates the damage. And they said the only thing that works is Jim Bennett's CES letter reply.
Wow.
And I was like, wow, yeah, that's great. And they said, so we're going to advertise this. They did sort of an advertising campaign for my reply. And I said, oh, well, do I see any of that money? No, you don't. Okay, well, thanks. And but I remember talking to John DeLynn, actually, offline, while we were doing our conversations. And I shared that story with him. And I said, I don't really understand a couple of things. One, why the church doesn't
make their own.
Do their own. And second, why my reply is sort of in any way effective. And he said, well, Jim, the answer to that question is that you are saying things that the church can't say. I mean, the church wants to say, but doesn't feel like it can. Basically, the church has been wrong in certain cases. I mean, the church is willing to admit that as President Uchtdorf said back in the day, there have been cases when leaders have simply made mistakes. Mm-hmm. And we acknowledge that mistakes have happened and mistakes are possible, but we're not willing to acknowledge any of the actual mistakes with any specificity and say, right, well, this was a mistake and we shouldn't have done this. And in my reply, I do that several times. Mm-hmm. And I've actually written a book that I don't know how I'm going to get published, but it's called Fallibility, a Love Story. And it's the idea that
Say the name of your book again, just in case it froze up. It's called what?
Fallibility, a Love Story.
Okay, I love it.
And the idea is that fallibility among individuals, but also even among church leaders, is not a bug in the plan. It's the feature of the plan.
Right.
It's the reason we are here. We should expect mistakes as we learn and we grow and we strive to become more Christ-like. And we should expect them institutionally as well as individually. And we should not be shaken by the fact that sometimes we've gotten it wrong.
Yeah. I completely agree. I think the challenge we have is this this way we still feel we need to pose as infallible, right? And it's really a challenge because I know we have, even with the gospel topics essays, the church seemed to be in this like really tough zone of we want to speak to the problems, but we don't want to introduce more people to the problems. So how do we do this, right? And so I think that's why it is such a gift to the church that you're doing this, that so that they can kind of offload that responsibility and have the deniability. If you got something wrong, that's okay with it. That doesn't look bad for the church. It's just you independent. They can cut you loose if they need to. You know what I mean? But and so I think there is something to that. But I think it's unfortunate because it's kind of this. If we didn't have this sort of overbelief or this fairy tale view of leaders, then we wouldn't, that really is the sandy foundation. And then people tremble lest they shall fall, right? And the foundation crumbles because it's a sandy foundation. And I do think it would behoove us to work on getting to more rock solid truth and not having these ideas of, follow the prophet can never lead us astray is just, I've thought for decades is a spiritually dangerous idea because it just isn't sound and it doesn't establish a good foundation. And so I think I'm really, it's interesting to hear that story because I am a bit wishing that we wouldn't do that. I wish that we wouldn't try to get our people to believe things that are going to doom so many of them to complete faith crisis where I need to speak carefully, but for the most part, I don't think it generally improves people's lives to leave the church. That hasn't been what I've seen. I'm not going to speak universally. There are always unique cases, but I think the church tends to be a blessing in our lives as individuals, as families, as communities, right? And I definitely don't think that people's lives tend to be better when they cease to believe in God. And this seems to be often that, we don't know where people's trajectory will go and where it will end. But I just think it would be so much better if we didn't set people up to encounter the kind of faith crisis that they often have with the comparison between what they've been taught in the church and what the CES letter says, when the truth really is kind of in the middle, right?
Well, no, I think that's exactly right. And I think, it's not even one of the things that I've also discovered in this whole space is that it's not even that the church teaches things, or it's not even the mistakes themselves.
Right.
It's the fact that the church hasn't trusted its members to be able to
the cover up is always worse than the mistake.
Cover up is worse than the crime. The term faith crisis is in common parlance, and I now sort of lean into the idea that it's more of a trust crisis.
Yeah.
Because, for instance, Jeremy Runnels in the CES letter obsesses over the rock and the hat. The fact that Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon not by looking at the plates with the Urim and Thummim, but by putting a rock in a hat and looking into the hat, and it obsesses over that. And to me, it doesn't make any difference at all. I don't know which one is weirder or which one, but as I've talked to people like Jeremy and others who are upset about the rock in the hat, it isn't the rock in the hat that upsets them. It's why didn't they tell us this?
Yes.
Why did they keep this from us? And so, and the approach the church often takes when people do this, when people discover things like the rock and the hat, or the people, when I was a missionary, the only way you could learn that Joseph Smith was a polygamist, or that, and I know you don't believe Joseph Smith was a polygamist.
I did. Yeah.
But the only way you could learn about just any of the Adam God theory, for instance, or any of the sort of doctrinal or historical,
the anti-Mormon lies, right?
The anti-Mormon lies that we now acknowledge as being true in our gospel topics essays. Mm-hmm. The only way you could learn them was some weird pamphlet that was dropped on your front door by a pastor, and it was really sort of easy to dismiss it.
Right.
And now you learn it with a few clicks in a Google search, and it's the first stuff that comes up. And when somebody goes to a leader and says, "Boy, I've just discovered this about the Kinderhook plates. I'm really concerned. I don't really understand why Joseph Smith would translate plates that were forgeries. And how do I stay?" And the response they get is, "You shouldn't have been looking at that."
Yeah.
I mean, part of the reason—
Read your scriptures. Read your scriptures.
Elder Corbridge gave a talk where he talked about you can't ask the secondary questions until you answer the primary questions. And the primary questions are, was Joseph Smith a prophet? And I think, well, geez, if I find out that Joseph Smith is carrying on with his housemaid behind Emma's back, I'm going to have a hard time trying to answer the primary question in the way you want me to answer it.
Yes.
Consider the possibility that Joseph Smith could be a prophet if I can't resolve what you're dismissing as a secondary question.
Right.
And I think one of the reasons why leaders do that, frankly, is that I think if you walked into 90%, maybe even higher, of bishop's office and in the church and brought up the Kinderhook plates, they would stare at you and have no idea what you're talking about.
Right.
And so I think that response is very often a fear response. It's a because the bishop is all of a sudden going, "Well, I don't know what that is, and am I supposed to know what that is, and what am I going to do about that?" And so it's just this kind of, you shouldn't be looking at that. You should be praying. You should be reading scriptures. You shouldn't be. And so what happens then when you get that response, when you have a sort of faith crisis and you bring it to authority, and the authority responds with shame, dismissively
in some way,
then the faith crisis escalates into a trust crisis. Then it's, I can't trust you. I can't trust these people. I can't, and so then the sort of shame and guilt that are the tools of, here, stay in the boat, whatever you do, and you're going to lose everything. Your life's going to go off the rails. You're going to be. It's like, well, I don't believe you. I don't believe you anymore. I don't trust you. I don't trust you. You wouldn't trust me to give me the straight dope about the church. You wouldn't trust me when I came with concerns. So why should I trust you? And so that, a lot of people, particularly in the rising generation that are leaving the church, are not going through the kind of faith crisis that I struggled with when I was 18, or that people my age now who discover these things are struggling with when they leave. They're just shrugging the church off. They're just, no, the church, this doesn't work for me, and I don't trust these guys, and these guys don't know what they're talking about. And they walk away without any consequence.
And you know what? It's interesting because I'm trying to think which is preferable. And I don't know, because how you were talking about, there really is all of this fear and shame and blame that are kind of, unfortunately, sometimes the tools to keep people in the wrong ways. And then those morph when people finally leave. That has all of that negative emotion morphs often into anger. And I think that's how we can understand the anger of people that feel so betrayed. They were lied to, they were betrayed, they want their money back, and then on top of it, now they're facing social rejection from their family and their community. Like, it's an extremely painful, painful process. And no wonder it results in anger for people, hopefully not permanent, but it's very difficult. But in some ways, that's more connected than sort of the apathy you're describing for others who were just like, yeah, no, thanks. So it's really, it's interesting. I don't know which is, like how do we work with either one? That's, and should we care? Should we care if people stay in the church, right? If it's not for them, should it matter? I guess is.
Well, I think we should care. I mean, if we really believe this is the restored gospel of Jesus Christ, we should care when people leave it behind. But I also believe that we should continue to care about people even if they do leave it behind.
Yes.
Because one of the other things that I talk about, you and I don't know if I want to mention names, but you and I have both had run-ins with somebody who very much wants a smaller church.
Yes.
And wants to see the church purged. And people like that traffic in what I call the Korihor template. If you read the scriptures and you read, how the prophets and how the examples that we have in the scriptures deal with people who leave are always Korihors. They're always secret antichrists. Korihor was a guy who secretly the devil had appeared to him and told him to start fighting against Christ, but he always knew the church was true, but he fought against Christ anyway. And so
how many times have I literally been called Korihor? It's become like my nickname at this point. People use it so often.
Sure.
It's shocking.
That's the only template that these people have to deal with. The idea that somebody could have a legitimate crisis of conscience.
I need to clarify that. I'm in the church solidly. I'm extremely active and I'm still called Korihor, but you're right. Anyone who leaves is called Korihor.
Me too.
Yeah.
Me too. But the thing is, these kinds of people that label everybody a Korihor cannot allow for the possibility that someone could have a legitimate crisis of conscience and say the church, I feel I need to leave the church because it's no. You're leaving the church because you wanted to sin, because you're wicked, because you've been deceived by the devil, and there's absolutely we have to attach this Korihor template to them and label them, even when this is somebody you've known your entire life. It could be your spouse.
Sometimes your parent. A lot of people's parents are leaving. Older people are leaving and trying to struggle because they have kids on missions or married kids. And I think it does such a disservice in so many ways. It misses the opportunity. Like I said, that the people who are different from us present an opportunity to us, definitely, right? That's the opportunity Jesus was presenting to his entire community. And you have the opportunity, you can either accept that opportunity or fight against it, right? But it also misses the entire point. I say this often, that I think that the Lord cares so much less about what we believe than about how we engage with and treat people who believe differently than we do, right? I think it's good to believe truth and be seeking truth and be engaged, but we all have to define what truth is. We all have to come to learn it. And what do we do in the meantime with people who disagree with us? And when we have our family members and we let when we let the church become something that interrupts family relationships or that strains family relationships, I'm just convinced that is the opposite of anything that God would want his church to create and to produce. Right? And that's why I love your conversation about the borderlands, because that's what I do feel like is so important, is holding hands with people from all the different spaces, trying to bridge these divides and create an ability to have conversations. And I just find it sad that so often it is the people in the church planting the flag that are the ones saying, no, you can't do that. You can't be there having conversations. You can't, right? It seems, and then it makes everyone else able to point to them and say, yeah, that's what you guys are. I don't want any part of it. All the people that have left. And then even for me, often when I engage with those kind of people, I'm like, are these my people? Do I really want to be with these people? Ew, like this doesn't feel good. Okay, well, for some reason, my internet completely just pooped out and I had nothing. And Jim has been so patient with me. I ended up finally, I'm at my local library where I have horrible fluorescent lighting above me and no good camera or microphone. So hopefully this will work for the rest of our conversation. But thank you so much for being so patient. That was quite an ordeal, but I really have enjoyed what we've been talking about so far.
Yeah, well, no problem on my end. I work from home, and so I wasn't going anywhere. So happy to continue the conversation. I'm not exactly sure where we left off.
I know, and it was probably something so exciting that people wanted to hear, but we'll just start again. This is what I think is an interesting space. So the space that I'm in, I think many of my listeners are no longer in the church, but we generally leave, or people that tend to share my perspective, tend to leave in the direction of the Book of Mormon rather than away from the Book of Mormon, right? Toward Joseph Smith rather than away from Joseph Smith. Whereas the people that read the CES letter tend to think Joseph was a fraud, it's all a fake. And I think people that are more in my space tend to think the restoration was true and the church has gone astray. And so it's a different, anyway, I was just thinking about it after what we've talked about so far. It's a slightly different, or I guess a very different dynamic that people struggle with. And I guess this is an area it sounds like you have quite a bit of experience and connection and familiarity with people who are affected by the CES letter, but maybe less with people who tend to view that Joseph Smith got things right and other leaders got things wrong. That's not exactly my perspective, but it's one that seems to be growing. And so I just am curious if you have encountered that much.
Not a lot. So is this sort of kind of the Denver snuffer direction?
Well, I think maybe he's like the best known, biggest name, scariest apostate, but so I don't think that it's interesting because I can't even get my head wrapped around the different perspectives there are in the different, I don't even know if we would call them groups.
Yeah.
I think that there are a lot of people that just like what different people say. Maybe there are some groups, but I know that I've read, have you read any of Denver Snuffer's books?
I have not.
Okay. I read 2 of his books and really appreciated them. And, but my understanding is I actually had him on the podcast a while ago. And my impression is that he actually wouldn't have left the church if he hadn't been kicked out. So I don't know that he intended to start a movement. I still don't know if he wants a movement, but yeah, so I would say Denver Snuffer. And then, but there seemed to be like, I don't even know what the genesis of it is. If it starts kind of with Avraham Gileadi and studying Isaiah and feel, it's interesting, but so I just was curious if, I guess it's kind of a somewhat similar, but somewhat different discussion on this side of it.
Right. No, I mean, that isn't an area where I have spent a lot of time. It's just largely new to me. I mean, it's in what I have seen in the people that I have interacted with, what would lead you to sort of that direction seems to be a very different dynamic from the people who just decide to leave the church altogether. The people that I end up dealing with are people who think, the church, it's not that the church needs to be more churchy.
Yeah.
And that's not really even, I think, a very good description of what you're talking about.
Right.
But it's I'm disillusioned with everything about the church. It's not that I want the church to double down on certain things that I find important, which I think is where the folks you're talking about seem to be.
Do you know what? This is what I think it actually comes down to, and this might be an interesting place to take this discussion. I think that what the CES letter does, and many of the other things, is hits at Joseph Smith and the restoration, right? Joseph Smith was a fraud. He was a womanizer. He was unfaithful. He was a con man, right? That's kind of the mode of the CES letter. And it's interesting to me that in many ways, the church narrative currently agrees with the CES letter. Like when I was, I had one of my meetings with my past stake president, and he was just kind of talking about how hard it is, how the CES letter can just take someone away. He's like, in the morning, they're faithful, active members of the church, and that night they're done, you know? And my response was, I just find some frustration, because I'm like, this is the problem. The CES letter says the same thing as the church, only, like, for example, about Joseph Smith's polygamy. The CES letter says Joseph Smith told Emma that an angel with a sword threatened him if he didn't sleep with the babysitter, right? And the church said, and the CES letter says Joseph Smith said that because he was lying, right? But the church says Joseph Smith said the exact same thing, but it was true. God actually did send an angel with a sword. I'm making a terrible straw man to say the angel with the babysitter, but you get what I'm saying, right? In a lot of ways, it tells the same story. And so that's one thing I find interesting, is that so what I was going to specify, I'm kind of going in circles. I'll get there really quickly. But so the CES letter hits on the restoration and Joseph Smith. And I think what many of us find, or what I have found, I did this, this wasn't my intention. I didn't set out to learn these things or discover this. But what the evidence looks like to me is that actually Joseph Smith was a pretty decent guy. And Emma Smith was, I don't want to understate. I think Joseph and Emma were amazing people. The more I look at their lives, I am astonished by who they were. And I'm amazed by their goodness and integrity, and just their positive character traits, combined with their sacrifice and their inspiration. And it looks like to me, later leaders introduced some things that I don't think Joseph ever was part of. And I don't think Joseph and Emma and Hiram were on board with. And the later leaders introduced things like polygamy and Adam God and the racist ban, the temple ban or the priesthood ban, and blood atonement, and and we can and so that's what I find interesting, is it's kind of like different steps in the game where you think that maybe the problems arise. Does that make sense? That way of explaining it? I guess people in my camp have had a Brigham Young crisis, not a Joseph Smith crisis.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't. If you want me to engage on that and engage on the idea that Joseph wasn't a polygamist or any of that, I don't know that I am equipped to do that. Because I disagree with you. I don't think you should be out of the church for disagreeing with me. I think there is space in the church for you to hold this kind of belief. I think the idea that Joseph was a really good guy and Emma was a really good person and they were just really amazing, and then it all goes to hell with Brigham Young and everybody else thereon, I think that is sort of a different manifestation of the infallibility problem. I think just about every problem in the church right now boils down to the false doctrine of prophetic infallibility. And people lose trust in their leaders, this trust crisis we talked about earlier, because they're taught their leaders are essentially infallible, and then they inevitably discover that they're not. And in the way you're framing Joseph Smith, it feels to me, and again, I'm probably straw manning here, it feels to me that we're trying to sort of construct an infallibility.
Right, I have Joseph on a pedestal and everybody else.
Joseph on a pedestal and an infallibility for Joseph that falls down a chasm once Brigham takes over.
Right.
And
Yep. And I know that's a very common perspective. I will say that, and I think that there are people who just view it that way. I can say that I think that when people engage more with the arguments and evidence, and this isn't necessarily the conversation that I think that we need to have, but I think that I would, I guess what I would say is I understand why it appears that way, and I would very strongly argue that it's not that way because I mean, my listeners know my history, but I believed thoroughly in polygamy. I was raised to believe in polygamy, and then when I learned polygamy was like not ever okay, not ever of God, never commanded, and always an abomination, then I already navigated, okay, Joseph Smith did this. I've been through all of the different, I've read the CES letter when I was more inclined to agree with much of it. I still think it's a hit job, a hit piece, and very skewed in its perspective. I think, I'm not saying I agree with it, but I didn't, for me, it was an interesting process of seeing Joseph Smith be sort of redeemed. Like a lot of my hard feelings, do you know what I mean? Or my feelings of like, man, that sucks. A lot of those got kind of where I had to go, oh, I think I saw this wrong. So I understand your perspective, but I do want to say that there are many people in this space that aren't coming to it that way. But I think it would be interesting to kind of, it was good to define sort of the problems, right? I guess I have two questions that I'd ask you. Well, and this first one isn't as much for you, it's just a general question. But one thing I've tried to, the people that are coming after me or other people in this space and trying to get our memberships in the church taken away, which is astonishing to me. Do you see a reason that believing that Joseph Smith started polygamy and the Helen Mar Kimball stories, the Fanny Alger stories, whatever stories we want to go to, do you see a reason that those would be less destructive to faith than believing, oh, Brigham Young got some things wrong? Why is it easier to say, I'm surprised that members of our church are saying, no, you have to believe that polygamy came from Joseph Smith. And if you believe that Brigham Young and his, I guess I would say conspirators started it, then you are destroying faith and you have to be kicked out of the church. I genuinely don't understand why it's better to believe that Joseph Smith did these things.
Well, so this is going to sound like a really tangential answer.
Okay. And I'm throwing something at you that you've probably never thought about. So.
No, but I think I will bring it back.
Okay.
I have spent the last week mourning the election results.
Okay.
And just absolutely devastated that we have chosen as the leader of this country somebody who has demonstrably demonstrated unfitness for the office. And I don't want to get into politics necessarily, except to say that one of the most destructive things that I think Donald Trump has done to this country is created a circumstance where we now live in separate realities. If you listen to Donald Trump describes America as the garbage can of the nation, where immigrants are coming and taking over 5-star hotels, eating cats and dogs, and and children are going to school, and without their parents' permission, they come home the next day a different gender, and just describing things that are factually, demonstrably not true. And this started when he first came down the escalator and started talking about things like the Muslims that were dancing on buildings right after 9/11. And when confronted with the fact that did not happen, he refused to back down and refused to say.
Okay.
So what I'm saying is, the thing that frustrates me the most about Trump and Trumpism is that we now have to look at things that are not true and sort of say, agree to disagree. Well, you think that America's a garbage can and people are getting shot as they go to buy a loaf of bread? Agree to disagree. No, I'm not going to agree to disagree. That's not happening. The things that Donald Trump says are objectively, factually not true. And it becomes more and more difficult to engage with Trumpers because we don't share a common set of facts. Facts are negotiable.
So I know you're going to bring this back around. Oh, you go ahead, and then I wanted to.
Well, no, to bring it back around. I mean, to say, yeah, I would like to believe in a church where Joseph Smith did not practice polygamy, because I personally find polygamy abhorrent, and I would like to believe I would like to believe that some of the things that church leaders didn't happen. But when you frame the question of wouldn't you rather believe this, I don't feel anybody should have the luxury of being able to believe things that are not true. I am convinced the historical record is such that Joseph Smith was a polygamist, and in order to be able to stay in the church, I have to find a way to reconcile that. And now
I want to clarify the question I asked. Go ahead.
So the question I asked.
Yeah, the question I asked wasn't, wouldn't you rather believe this? The question I asked was, why do you think one would be more destructive to faith than the other? Why that was the question I asked, but maybe you don't necessarily think that. But that's
it probably is. I mean, you go back to Boyd K. Packer, who famously said some things that are true are not very useful.
Yeah.
And if you believe D. Michael Quinn, he said other things like the reason I can't stand historians is they idolize the truth, and the truth destroys faith. Well, from my perspective, I don't think we have any choice but to accept the truth. I mean, it'd be nice if the truth were something else, and it may very well be that truth destroys faith in circumstances where people can't reconcile truths that they feel are inconsistent with what their faith is. And then truth can destroy faith. But from my perspective, I don't think we have any other alternative but to reckon with the truth as it is.
I don't think truth destroys faith, because faith can only be actual, legitimate faith if it's in something that is true, right? And when when things that are not true are being shown to be not true, we shouldn't see that as destroying faith. We should see that as clarifying truth, right? And so, but I want to ask you something, because I'm hearing what you are saying. And so, you know how we started out this conversation, and you talked a lot about how we view people who leave the church, right? And when we think we are in their brains, and we think, oh, they just wanted to sin, and they just this, and they just this, we do a disservice, because we can't be empathetic with them. We can't really be connected with them because we're too busy judging them in what we think we are. And I want to propose, is it possible that maybe people who vote for Donald Trump were doing the same thing to them? Because as someone who actually voted for Donald Trump, voted for RFK and a lot of the other things that I'm seeing happening in this country, I feel really frustrated when I hear people going off on Donald Trump like that and saying that we're living in two different realities, and I have the reality and that's not the reality, when I'm seeing the opposite, right? And is it possible to say, okay, people are being fed, like I just think that we are in a time when all of the divisive forces of hell have been unleashed in our society, and we are trying to get people to judge one another and to dehumanize one another and see each other, try to explain people in terms of what we assume their motives are, rather than going, okay, is it possible that an intelligent, informed person with integrity that is a good person could disagree with me on this? And if they do, could that be because they have different information than I have? Or we are both seeing, maybe there are things I'm seeing that they're not seeing, and things they're seeing that I'm not seeing. Maybe we're prioritizing different things in different ways. But is it possible that they're not just wrong and I'm right?
Well, of course, it's always possible that I'm wrong. and it's always I mean, that's not what I'm talking about.
Okay.
I go back to Daniel Patrick Moynihan's famous comment that everyone is entitled to their own opinion. Nobody is entitled to their own facts.
Yes, I agree with that.
And I mean, so as you start talking about these things, I am happy to agree to disagree about policy. I am not happy to agree to disagree about facts.
I agree with you.
No,
yes.
Well, so I mean, so this is the reason I find it so frustrating to engage with Trumpers is not that I disagree with them on policy. It's that we don't share a common set of facts. You believe something. I mean, is it possible that your set of facts is correct and mine is not?
Or wait. Let me. Is it possible that I don't believe the set of facts you think I believe? Right? Is it possible?
Well, I'm not here to judge what set of facts you believe or what set of facts you don't believe. Right. I can look at Donald Trump and say, when you tell me that Haitians are eating cats and dogs, that is factually incorrect. So I am not going to sit here and respect and agree to disagree over a matter of fact.
Okay,
that's not happening. That is not true. And so for me to say, okay, well, let's now start talking about policies. It's like, well, what policies am I going to be able to talk about with your fictional scenario that is not happening?
And so for me, when I'm hearing these kinds of discourses and I'm seeing, and this is interesting to get into politics, because especially right after this election and especially with such passionate feelings. But for me, I have been so frustrated by this focus on, and I hate to get into politics because I don't want to alienate everyone. This is where I am. I'm like, in so many ways, what has happened has not been good for our nation. I thought that Donald Trump would be out of it clear back in the first race when he said that to Megyn Kelly. And I was like, okay, good, let's be done with him. So I would never call myself, and everyone's different. I know my mom really appreciates Donald Trump. I don't. But I do not appreciate the other side. I do not appreciate the fact that it is this focus on criticism of Donald Trump in order to ignore things that I find to be absolutely deplorable on the other side. And it's this whole focus of how could anybody vote for him without taking any responsibility or ownership of the alternative, and how so it feels like there's a big arrogance there that's not recognizing things that are really important to me, and that and I don't like feeling like the good people voted one way, the bad people voted one way. I think that it's good if we can, because I understand that you're saying this is the set of facts, but I also know that also, like, how big that cat and dog statement is to you.
The cat and dog statement is a shorthand.
It's symbolic, right?
Do you believe, for instance, that Donald Trump lost in 2020?
Oh, see, this is where this is what I think. Honestly, I think that just about everything was done to make that election look as suspect as possible. And I think it's very unfortunate. I think that saying that it is racist to have voter ID is something that I don't think is genuine.
It's a yes or no question, though. It's a yes or no question. Did Donald Trump win?
No, it's not a yes or no question, because you're pinning.
It's a matter of fact. It's a matter of fact. It's a matter of record. I mean, if we can't agree on that,
but see, why do you assume?
Then to go on and say how you feel about something that is based on something that we don't agree on what the basic facts are, then there's no way to have a productive.
Well, okay, let me ask you this: what facts do you have? Like, if we're going to look at something as divisive and sort of far from us as the 2020 election, what facts do you have to know for sure exactly how that, like, are you claiming there's never any cheating in elections?
No, I haven't said that at all. You're launching into sort of some whataboutism or to some.
No, I'm not.
It's a basic principle. Did Donald Trump win or did he lose? This was litigated.
Well, let me ask you this: was there any election fraud in that? Because you're giving me this yes or no trap question. Let me turn it back on you. Was there any cheating in that election? Was there any cheating in that election?
There was not any verified cheating that would have altered the course of the election. No.
So there was no cheating in the election.
That's not what I said. I think.
Okay, but that's what I'm asking you, because that's what you're forcing me to say.
Oh boy. Okay. No,
Well, but see, I think this is really unfortunate to go here because I don't
no,
think
it's not unfortunate to go here because if you're going to start talking about, um, I am happy to agree to disagree with you about matters of opinion. And I'm also happy to agree that you should not be kicked out of the church for believing things that I don't believe, even if I think what you believe is factually incorrect. I think the church has room for people on all over the place in every spectrum. I don't want to see a smaller church. And I think the church should be able to include people like you who believe that Joseph Smith did not practice polygamy and that Brigham Young instituted polygamy. But what I am not willing to agree to disagree with you on is that matters of fact are subject to negotiation. Because if you sit here and tell me the sky is green and I tell you the sky is blue,
I understand.
I mean, there's no basis for a factual discussion about the sky.
Is it possible that it's really, this is something I say often, it's really, really easy to know what the verdict should be when you've only heard the prosecution and you haven't yet heard the defense, or vice versa. Is it possible that there are sources, do you think that it's possible that there are sources that you have not been aware of, or facts about other sources that you have not been aware of? Is that a possibility?
Anything is a possibility. It's a possibility that aliens came down and changed the election results.
So you think you know absolutely, like on the
no, I
on
mean,
the polygamy debate.
This is what's so exhausting.
Okay.
Is that I don't want to spend any time debating matters of verifiable fact. There really. I mean, whether you like Donald Trump or not, whether you want it, for instance, I wanted Kamala Harris to win. She didn't. I accept that. I'm frustrated by it. I wish that weren't the case, but I'm not going to sit here and spin some weird, bizarre story that Donald Trump didn't win this last election fair and square. He did. It's a fact I don't like. It's a fact I wish I could change. But anybody that comes and says, okay, well, Kamala Harris really won the election, there's no basis for discussion there. There's no way to carry that conversation to a productive place where we're having some kind of productive exchange of ideas, because we do not live in a common reality. Now, could it be that your reality where Donald Trump won is the right one, and my reality where I'm imagining Kamala Harris won is the right one? I don't think that would be the right one. But
so what do we do? What do you propose? Because for me, when there is a difference of opinion, the appropriate and best action to take is to engage and present facts and engage in discourse.
When there is a difference of opinion, it is entirely appropriate to engage. When there is a difference of fact, it's a waste of everybody's time.
So how can you know for sure that a fact is a fact if you haven't challenged it to the most rigorous? Because what I hear in you, and I know you can get frustrated and shake your head, but really think of how many facts have been known for sure until they were disproven. It's not an uncommon occurrence at all in human history, and even in somewhat recent history, right? This happens relatively regularly, and we have the pride, the arrogance to think that we know for sure, and so we won't look. When somebody comes and says, I understand your perspective and I know all of the sources it's based on, and I'm willing to engage on the sources and let's talk about it, why would you say, no, that's not a conversation worth having? Because I mean, I don't understand that. That is, I mean, to go to just the stupid Galileo and Copernicus, right? They were arguing against facts. We can't live in the same universe because our universe is shaped differently in our brains, right? But what proved to be useful was the mathematical models that showed the truth. I think there are fewer verified facts than we tend to think we are. There are a lot of opinions that look like facts, or a lot of perspectives, but there are lots of things that are it's very hard to say for sure about many historical issues. But as one as fuzzy as Joseph Smith's polygamy, I'm actually surprised that people feel so dogmatic and certain about it when generally they're not even that familiar with the sources.
Well, with regard to Joseph Smith's polygamy, I would agree with you there because I have not looked at the sources as closely as you have. I have not engaged on that. And so I am open to the possibility. What you are saying in broad terms makes sense. Of course, the whole nature of science is to constantly challenge what we consider to be true, and that's the way we discover things and new things. That things we thought were true were not true. The reason why I brought up the election is that, particularly with regard to Donald Trump, I'm not trying to disqualify him here, although I do think it's disqualifying that, he's a rapist and he's a felon and he's a terrible human being. But what I'm
I could throw right back at you the Hunter Biden laptop and the whole thing.
About Hunter Biden's laptop. Who cares? Hunter Biden will never be president, and he's not president, and I don't care.
It wasn't just Hunter, but okay. Anyway, I don't think that's useful.
No, but here's the point: is that if you're not willing to concede that he lost the election and say that there still must be some other information out there that would prove that that's not the case.
It's not that. Let me.
No, the reason why the cats and dogs story is so helpful is that it is very easy to demonstrate that was not true, that factually is not happening, did not happen. Everybody on the ground saying that this is not happening. The Republican mayor saying this is not happening.
I guess this is what I'm surprised by, though, is how many different things are there that politicians have said that are not true, right? We have so many examples. And so the reason I think that it matters is because, again, this hyper focus on this one issue that is not important to me, right? That it's not, I didn't vote for cats and dogs or stories about them. I know I'll offend people, but I don't like Donald Trump at all. I don't care to listen to him. I don't, I happen to really like Robert Kennedy Jr., which probably makes you think I'm crazy in some other ways, but I really like, right? And so, but what I can tell you is, I bet you I have studied many of these topics, like exponentially more than you have. And so that's what gets to be frustrating, is to be called someone who's crazy when I know the facts and I know the sources by somebody who doesn't.
Well, maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I'm crazy. I'm happy.
I don't think it's that you're crazy. I don't think it's
what I'm saying is we don't live in the same reality. And maybe your reality is the real reality and my reality is not. But when you start talking about basic matters of fact and say that they're up for negotiation, I don't know how to follow you into that.
That's where I push back. That's where I push back, is because you continually say that there are matters of fact. When we say the science is settled, that is an anti-science statement, right? When we say this is fact, and what it really is reliance on experts, reliance on everybody says this, therefore it must be true, therefore I must look down on people who say something different and refuse to look at their facts, because I can just write them off as crazy because I know better, even though I don't know anything about it other than what everybody else says. It's just groupthink and reliance on experts, reliance on this is the learned wisdom of our day. And so therefore, there's no reason to look into any of these other issues. And that's what I take issue with, because I think that's how we become, I don't know. I don't understand why that's beneficial. It's an interesting perspective that's very different from mine.
I find it exhausting. I found since Donald Trump came down from the escalator, I have found it exhausting.
Can we talk about? Can you choose a different example than Donald Trump?
But see this. This is actually just a major crisis of faith for me. To be honest, the election has been, because I'm now sitting in the pews with people who I believe voted for fascism, so let me push back, because
would it be helpful to understand that there are people who view it the exact opposite way, that there are people who think they are voting for freedom genuinely? And I can explain some of the reasons why. Because
No,
I think it's
that wouldn't
unfortunate.
help at all. That wouldn't help at all because I am convinced that whether or not you believe you voted for fascism is largely irrelevant to the fact that you voted for fascism. Because we belong to a church that claims to have unique access to the gift of the Holy Ghost. That we tell every 8-year-old child that you are being a gift that's going to help you discern truth from error, help you discern right from wrong, help you discern good from evil, in a way that gives you access to this that people outside the covenant don't have. And to be able to say that, and then to say, okay, well, 70% or 2/3, I guess, is the number went down a little bit this election, but roughly 2/3 of the people who have that gift did not exercise it in a way where they were able to recognize that what they voted for was fascism. Now you can tell me and you can come back to me and say, no, it really wasn't fascism and you're wrong and you're crazy. And maybe I'm wrong and I'm crazy. And that's, but we don't have a common, I mean, because relitigating reality is something that I find just exhausting beyond measure. It's not that I'm judging you. It's not that I'm condemning you to hell. It's not that I'm kicking you out of the church. It's that I just really have a hard time over and over and over again trying to establish a baseline of reality upon which we can agree. And I don't want to sit here and spend hours and hours defending whether or not the sky is blue, because the sky is blue. And is there a possibility that the sky may be secretly green, or that I haven't looked at it closely enough and haven't done as much research as you have on what the color of the sky is? Yeah, but you reach a point where, you know what, I'm comfortable believing the sky is blue, and I'm not comfortable revisiting fundamental tenets of reality over and over again, because I'm supposed to somehow be inclusive and accepting of people who aren't willing to accede basic facts.
So what about people who say the gospel is true and that is fact, and you can deny it, but you can't deny fact? I've heard so many people say you can have your own opinion, but your opinion does not affect the fact of the gospel. So you can leave if you want to, but you are the one leaving. Do you agree with that attitude? Because this is what I'm finding so fascinating. We just were talking about how much more important it is our relationships and preserving our relationships rather than what we believe. And it's more important how we view someone that agrees with us rather than we're on the right side. And then all of a sudden we get to these couple of topics and it's like a whole different energy. Because I know you say you find it exhausting to deal with facts, but I'll tell you, it is exhausting to be viewed this way and treated this way. It is exhausting to have people say, I don't want to be in church with you because you voted that way, or you have your own set of facts and they're ridiculous. And it's too exhausting to waste time talking about. Comparing Joseph Smith's polygamy to the sky is blue is not accurate. And comparing a political opinion to the sky is blue is not accurate. It's more accurate to say, let's compare it to our testimony in the church, right? It's a complex set of principles and values and yes, data points, facts that come into play that people are weighing out. And I think it's a mistake to vilify people who weigh that out differently.
I'm not trying to vilify you. I'm saying I don't see anything productive in engaging with you if we don't share a common set of facts. I'm not judging you. I'm not condemning you. I'm not.
No. To say I don't see it useful to engage with you is basically saying, I mean, that's a pretty extreme statement, right? Like saying I'm having a hard time sitting in the pews.
Yeah.
You see the world this way. And I guess what I'm asking is it possible that there would be a way to open up and see and not dehuman? Because I'll tell you, I know that we're going to
dehumanized anybody. I'm not trying to kick them out of the pews. I recognize this is a me problem. This isn't a them problem. This is how do I reconcile the fact that I'm sharing pews with people with whom I don't share a common set of facts. And if you'll notice, I haven't left the pews. I'm still going to church. I'm still going to participate. I'm not trying to vilify you. I'm not calling you names.
Well, you don't have to make it about me. You just
No, but I'm not. But see, so the point is that there are things in the church. I mean, to compare it to the church, to compare it to testimony. There are certain elements of the church that are either true, factually true, or not. For instance, Joseph Smith either had a set of gold plates that were a certain dimension and that were a physical object, or he did not. One of those things is true, one of those things is not. Now, there are elements and principles of the gospel that are open to a broader interpretation. What does it mean to love your neighbor, for instance? There are a lot of answers to that question, all of which are true, but may not necessarily be identical, because you are dealing in matters of opinion or matters of interpretation or matters of things that are not black and white. But there are certain things, either the light is green or the light is red when you're at a traffic stop. It's not an agree to disagree situation. You don't get to speed through the traffic stop in a red light and say, well, I believed it was green because the light was red. There are things that are factually, verifiably true, and there are elements of the restored gospel that are factually, verifiably true. Do you believe, did a personage named Moroni live on the ancient American continent and then later, thousands of years later, appear to a young boy in his bedroom to tell him that there was a record that he had to translate? Did that happen? Did it not happen?
So I think this is where it gets interesting, because it's easy to lump things in. I love the little spot in, I don't know if you've seen the little movie Inside Out. I think that's what it's called, where they drop the box of puzzle pieces that are facts and opinions. And they say, these are so hard to tell apart. They look all the same, right? It's hard to differentiate fact from opinion. And that's kind of what I feel like we bump into.
Not always. It's not hard to differentiate a red light from a green light.
Right, but so if I bring out a historical document, the fact of the historical document is the fact, right? The interpretation of it is where the challenge comes in. And so if somebody brings out a historical document and says, this is evidence, for example, that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy, and then someone else says, no, because you're leaving these 4 documents off the table, you haven't looked at those, and look at this other interpretation of this document that fits it better. That is where the discussion should be had. So we do have some facts. We have facts in the historical record, and those tend to be the documentary history, right? We can find this fact and we can look at this object together and agree that it exists and agree on several things about it. But it does not tell the complete story. A historical document is not a red light or a green light. And even a red light or a green light isn't necessarily, like, if there's someone that's not part of, if an alien came and didn't know what red and green meant, right? They wouldn't interpret it appropriately. We have to bring to the facts our understanding in a much broader perspective, and then engage over what, like, I'm working right now to respond to several of the historic items that people are putting forward to say this is evidence of Joseph Smith's polygamy, right? Because and it's really surprising how bad their arguments actually are. This is what always happens. I'll just tell you, Jim, and I know, like, this is very common. People are so certain that Joseph Smith was a polygamist, just as this is my topic, right? They absolutely know it. And then when we get into talking about it, they're like, I don't actually know the sources. Even the historians, people think the case for Joseph Smith's polygamy is infinitely stronger than it actually is. And it's because we've been given this handed down wisdom, right? You said when you were on your mission, you couldn't even get evidence to say that Joseph wasn't a polygamist. And then all of a sudden in the 80s, D. Michael Quinn starts doing his work. We start getting other things. The RLDS changes their perspective. And all of a sudden we come to now where it is settled factual history that Joseph Smith was a polygamist and no one even needs to ask the question. So when we have people saying this actually never was settled, the evidence isn't strong, and people can't defend that like people can't use documentation to defend the paradigm that Joseph Smith was a polygamist because it's just been accepted as reality and people haven't thought that they needed to dig into it. So the historians that actually start looking into it are very surprised to see how weak the evidence for it actually is, the documentary evidence of this. And so so I understand what you're saying, and we can look at all of the different things that we disagree on, but there are things, I think what's exhausting is people who just say, this is fact, this is fact, this is fact, but have no idea what their idea that it's fact is based on. Have very little idea of the actual documentary evidence and the history and what we should be discussing.
Oh, and that's fine. I mean,
Let me ask you a question.
I told you from the outset that this is not an area of study or research in which I am particularly fluent. This is what I would prefer. This is what would be so delightful if someone was like, oh, wow, I actually am not that up on all of those sources. That's really interesting. I'll be curious to hear why you have that perspective, rather than, I don't know much about these sources, but I know for a fact that you're wrong. No, well, I think, and again, you've tried to sort of poison the well with regard to experts in terms of all we do is trust experts. But my position on this is based on my confidence in my chosen experts, in Richard Bushman, in D. Michael Quinn, in I've respected historians who have looked at this. I think at least with as much rigor as you have, if not more. And I have read their work and am confident in their conclusions. Is it possible that they are wrong and that I am wrong? Yes, of course it is. But so I have an MBA from Brigham Young University, and I remember being taught in a finance class how to calculate the net present value of an asset. And the teacher said, there are several ways to do that. And you know what that means, don't you? And I said, no, I don't know what that means. He says, it means that none of them are any good. If one of them were entirely reliable and something where we could get exactly the answer we wanted, then we wouldn't have to have another one, right? So when there are those kinds of differences and when there's those kinds of challenges, I recognize that there's the possibility that that one person's interpretation is wrong and another person's interpretation is not wrong. But the other thing I learned in MBA school is an idea. I think I can sum up the entire MBA experience in 3 words, and those 3 words are: markets are efficient. And the idea that anybody that comes to you and says that they know the market better than the market itself, I can beat the market average. I can beat the Dow Industrial average because I am smarter than the market. Invariably, they are wrong. The market is efficient in terms of how it manages and processes information. And if you think that you know better than the market and can meet a market need better than the market is doing it, you are very likely wrong, because the conglomeration of information that comes together in the entirety of market is efficient at filtering out the kind of special wisdom that the market gurus seem to have. And I'm sort of applying that principle with regard to the question of Joseph Smith's polygamy is one that has been litigated since the time that Joseph Smith was alive. I mean, since the days of the Nauvoo expositor trying to expose his polygamy. This is a question that has been litigated and relitigated by historians, and an entire church sort of sprung up around the idea that he was not a polygamist, which is now the Community of Christ, which now accepts institutionally that yes, in fact, he was. So the weight of historical consensus, the weight of historical evidence that has been litigated and relitigated and relitigated for centuries now, or at least for over a century now, has come down on the side that, yes, in fact, he was a polygamist. Now, is it possible that all of that is wrong and you are right? Yes, it is possible. It does not strike me as being likely. And it also does not strike me as being disqualifying to you to be an participating member of the church. And it does not qualify you as being a bad person or being, I mean, I'm not trying to judge you as a human being. I'm not trying to judge your faith. I'm not trying to in any way vilify you or criticize you even as a human being. It's saying, I am unlikely to be persuaded. I mean, and then when you come back and say, well, I've done a whole lot more research than you have, Jim. I'm sure you have. I think Richard Bushman and Leonard Arrington and D. Michael Quinn and whatever.
Well, I understand, but let me
a whole lot of more research than you have.
So you do realize, like Bushman and Quinn and Arrington, they have footnotes, right? They have sources. We now have access to the exact same sources that they had access to, and we actually have more knowledge available to us than they had when they were writing their books, right? And because many things have happened since then. And so this is it's interesting to have it be like, okay, consensus is king. And so I have a couple of responses. You are correct that markets are efficient. My husband is a MBA from BYU as well, and he loves to say that as well. But part of the reason, in my perspective, markets are efficient is because there are always adversarial motives, right? And so everybody is keeping each other. That's why markets are efficient, because of the everybody going back and forth, right? So nobody has the upper hand. And if we get a monopoly, markets aren't as efficient, I guess I would say. But so I think that's what we're trying to say in this in this realm as well. So if we say, look, in the 1980s and the 1990s, they built great cars. And I trust the experts that built those cars. And we don't need anything more. That's kind of what I'm hearing, because that work was done 10, 20, 30 years ago, much of it, that where we get our consensus. And we are not acknowledging how much more access we have. The Joseph Smith Papers has been a game changer. All of us are able to see not only all of the footnotes that those great historians used in their books, but we're also able to see all of the stuff that they didn't include, that wasn't part of the discussion, that really should be part of the discussion, right? So it is possible to move knowledge forward and not just be rest on our laurels of those experts said it and we're done. And I understand that we have a lot of respect for PhDs and all of that, but I think where our respect should be is on the sources. Look, we can look at every single source. We don't have to just read the narrative that they give us. We also can look at their method, their historical methodology, and see how they've been taught and trained to handle sources, and see if we agree with that. We do have access not to special knowledge, but to investigation and to independent thought. And we don't have to be stuck on the reliance on experts. And so I think, anyway, that's part of what I find frustrating, is just this idea that this conversation shouldn't be had because I already know everything I need to know, because those guys already said it.
No, it's not that this conversation shouldn't be had. It's that I find it exhausting to converse with anybody with whom we do not share a common set of facts. That's where my frustration.
You keep saying that, and I want to know.
With regard to Joseph Smith, I mean, I'm happy to have this conversation. Initially, I had told you that I don't know that I have anything to offer this conversation because I have not done the extensive research that you have. And I'm happy to listen to you try to convince me that Joseph Smith was not a polygamist. I don't know that that's going to be particularly productive because, first of all, let me back up a little bit. I believe very firmly, very strongly, that William Shakespeare was a pseudonym. That the man who was credited with writing the works of William Shakespeare is a man who was a butcher's apprentice and later a grain merchant in Stratford-upon-Avon, and he never wrote anything in his life. And that after he died, with the first folio published in 1623. He was attributed these works after he was dead and after the man who wrote the works was dead, because the man who wrote the works, Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, for whatever reason, this was not something that noblemen were allowed to do and that he was not allowed to do publicly. And I think there are a number of, I could discuss this with you all day long, and because I believe that the experts or the people, I believe the experts are wrong. And I believe I have information, and I think the consensus is sort of shifting in my direction. But for me to sit here and talk to you about it, or to talk to your listeners or viewers about it, everybody's eyes are going to glaze over, because this isn't really an issue in which that they've invested any kind of interest or time. And anytime I try to get on a soapbox about this, most people go, I just don't care. Now, I care more about whether or not Joseph Smith was a polygamist than you likely care about the identity of William Shakespeare. But
I think there's a big problem with the analogy. I like the analogy. I'm interested in that. They made an interesting movie about that theory, and I think it is an interesting theory.
I hated that movie, but that's another story.
I didn't love it either, but I think it is an interesting theory. But here's the difference. I'm not saying to you, we don't share a common set of facts. And if you believe that, we don't share facts, and I find it exhausting. And so you can believe that. I don't believe you should be kicked out of the Shakespeare Society. And but I know that I'm right and consensus is right. And right, because I would, like I said, if you said that, I'd be like, that's really interesting.
My dogmatism on common set of facts has been focused on Trump. I mean, the fact that I can't get you to admit that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election is where I think we don't share a common set of facts, because I mean that is, I think,
let me say
well
this.
established
the 2020 election.
Reality is just about anything else that has ever happened in the history.
Let me clarify
of the
this.
States.
Trump lost the 2020 election. We've just watched, right? I don't know what it would mean to say he didn't lose the 2020 election. Asking the question of were there problems with that election is a different question. I don't like that voter confidence is hurt by what we saw in that election. I think it is a challenge to believe that Joe Biden got more votes than any president in history, and way more than Kamala got. And right, I think that there are some issues that should be looked into in regard to American elections currently. I think we're not in good status.
I feel a little better that we can agree on with it, that we then I'm willing to have that discussion with you.
Okay.
If you can concede the basic underlying fact. So I feel better.
We had Joe Biden as our president for the last 4 years. Yes, Trump lost the election. That's not anyway. But what I'm uncomfortable with often when people like Brian Hales, his favorite thing to do is to compare me to a flat earther, right? And so that's what I find frustrating, is it's saying, instead of just having the discussion about this topic, it's what can I compare it to make it seem ridiculous, right? And so
what I compared it to was something that I find very meaningful and important to me. For instance, it's not what I believe about Shakespeare is considered ridiculous and absurd. And so I think, identify with how you feel, because you're advancing a theory that is often dismissed as ridiculous and absurd. What I am trying to say is, if you're going to try to convince me your theory is true, I'm not the audience.
You're not interested. You're not interested in that conversation, right? I understand that. This would be my request. I do think that the Shakespeare analogy is a good one. I just think it's important to recognize that I, as someone who haven't spent time looking into that. I'm not telling you that's ridiculous and you can believe that, but you're just like a flat earther, or you're someone that won't admit election results.
I've never called you a flat earther, and I've never even said that it's illegitimate. I'm open to the possibility. I'm open to the possibility that Joseph Smith was not a polygamist, but it seems very unlikely to me for the reasons that I've enunciated. And if you want to spend the time focused on essentially debating whether or not Joseph Smith was a polygamist, I don't see that as a productive discussion.
Okay, so so I am just curious, can you just nutshell, if it's possible, and then we can move off from this topic and probably wrap up, but what do you find to be the most compelling pieces of evidence about Joseph Smith's polygamy? Like, what would you say? I believe it because of this.
I can't think of anything. I believe it because I think the weight of historical evidence, the preponderance of evidence, leans in that direction. I mean, before you use the analogy about saying, well, okay, we used to build cars in the 80s and the cars we build now are much better than the cars we built in the 80s because we know more. And to some degree, that analogy works, but where it breaks down is that there is a core black and white element at the base of this argument. And that is either Joseph Smith married women other than Emma or he didn't. And no amount of time passages changes that fundamental reality. Either that happened or it didn't. And, our evaluation of his historical documents may improve or become more sophisticated, or heaven forbid, or there could be more historical documents that have yet to come to light. That seems to become increasingly less likely the further distance you get from a historical event. And we have the Joseph Smith papers now, although anyway.
What were you going to say about that?
At its base, either you are right or you are wrong. Either you are correct that Joseph Smith was not a polygamist, or you are incorrect and he was. And no amount of sophistication of historical research will change the underlying fact, the black and white fact of whether or not Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. Now, we may not have the resources to conclusively be able to determine that. And that's one of the most frustrating things about polygamy is that the records are so scant for reasons that I think are obvious, and that nobody who was practicing polygamy wanted to be discovered practicing polygamy. And so I think that, but at its base, there is a right or wrong answer to this question.
Well, the historians will tell you that's not actually how history works very often, right? The best we can do is look through our lens to try to get to look at the sources and see what interpretations we can find from them. And, there's
how you interpret the reality is fine. And historians can't conclusively prove many, many things that have happened in history. But they happened or they didn't.
But our ability to know them is the question, right?
Well, that's true. I'm conceding that. I'm saying we may not know conclusively what happened.
Right.
And I know that's how history works. I know that history just sort of sorts through the scraps of civilization and tries to make sense of them, and that it's very, very difficult to pin down historical fact when there isn't sufficient evidence to do so.
Yes, and I hope you would agree that the more pieces of evidence we bring to the discussion, the better, right? That if we can say, look, this has all been ignored, or this has not been focused on enough, or these are some of this is like the reason you think that all of these people were Joseph Smith's wives is because of this. This is the weight of the evidence. How good is this evidence actually compared to this other body of evidence that's been ignored that says Joseph Smith wasn't a polygamist? And so that's the only thing I'm hoping to where I'm hoping to move the dial is to say this conversation needs to be had, and it's not based on people who can't accept reality, and it's not based on motivated thinking or motivated reasoning, and it's not based on faith and putting someone on a pedestal and wishful thinking. It's not based on any of those things. It is based on hard-nosed, serious investigation of the historical body of the historical documents, right? That is what it actually is. We are looking at the documentary evidence and trying to make the most sense of it, to do our best to see what happened and see if our version of it is accurate. And more work is being done all the time. I will tell you, historian after historian who actually will look into this is surprised by the fact that what they thought was a sound body of evidence is not. And so I know that we love to say that this has been debated forever, it's settled. It hasn't at all. In fact, the one time it was tried in a court of law, this actually was tried in a court of law. The question of whether or not Joseph Smith was a polygamist, well, it was the question of who was the actual proper inheritance of whose church
You're talking
was
about the
actually
temple
living
lot.
Joseph Smith's church, right? But that judge actually found in favor of the people saying that Joseph was not a polygamist. This was tried in a court of law while the wives were alive to testify, and most people haven't even read through that testimony to see for themselves why the judge determined it that way. And yet we claim that this has been tried and settled, but in the opposite. With the opposite verdict. And so I find that interesting.
Okay.
But anyway, well, I'm kind of sad that the conversation went this direction. I was hoping we were going to talk about some other things. So anyway, I hope it wasn't too frustrating. We'll see what the audience
and I hope you don't come away from this thinking Jim Bennett thinks I'm an idiot and that thinks I should be kicked out of the church, because I don't think that.
No, I appreciate that. I do come away from it thinking, oh, Jim Bennett's pretty closed-minded. That's how and maybe I'm too open-minded because I'm willing to consider a broad range of things and look into them. But that's the only thing I hope that I generally wish that we could look at one another and think, they probably have really good reasons for thinking what they think and believing what they believe.
I think you probably have excellent reasons for believing what you believe. I haven't tried to claim otherwise. I don't think otherwise. I mean, to say I'm closed-minded or open-minded, I think that's framing the discussion in a different way from how I think it's productive.
Oh, tell me, because I would love a better framing.
Well, sure. It's the framing of, I don't know. I think I'm backtracking if I try to do that.
Oh, okay.
Because the framing of, I'm happy to argue about opinions. I'm not interested in arguing about facts. Now, and factually, either Joseph Smith was a polygamist or he was not. For my faith, it's not that I've closed myself off to the idea that Joseph Smith may not have been a polygamist. I think it's very unlikely, and if pressed, I can try to offer the reasons why, and they may sound silly because I, again, am not a scholar. I haven't studied this extensively. But it's not that I'm closed off to the idea. It's that my faith is not determined by whether or not Joseph Smith was a polygamist, and that I have incorporated my acceptance of Joseph Smith's polygamy into how I view the church and how I view my faith. And so whether or not he is a polygamist doesn't matter in the sense that he doesn't have to be one or the other for me to be able to continue to believe. So I can have an academic discussion with you about it, but it seems to me that it is not an academic discussion to you, that to you, your faith is contingent to some degree on Joseph Smith not being a polygamist, that if Joseph Smith were a polygamist, that would affect your faith in some way. And maybe I'm wrong on that.
You are wrong. I already told you it didn't affect my faith when I did believe that. But okay. I do have a question that, and I'm guessing I might know the answer. What is your opinion on Section 132? Do you believe that is revelation from God that should be canonized?
I believe Section 132 has some of the most beautiful and the most contemptuous doctrine in the entirety of the church. The whole idea of deification, that we are the children of God who can become like God. When our primary children sing the song, "I am a child of God," they are essentially referencing section 132, because that doctrine is enunciated in the early verses of that revelation more clearly and with more force and specificity than anywhere else in Scripture. And then you get to the talk about virgins and taking more wives, and that Emma is going to be destroyed if she stands in the way. And you get something that I think is unspeakably ugly and awful, and so my answer to that question is, I think that the things that are of God in that section are revelation, and the things that are contemptuous and evil in that revelation are not. And I think that goes to the matter of how prophets work, and this whole idea of fallibility we talked about before the lights went out. But a lot of people will say, for instance, okay, were they speaking as a prophet or were they speaking as a man? And that's a distinction I reject, because every time a prophet speaks, he is always speaking as a man, even when he is speaking as a prophet. That the whole nature of mortality is such that you can never remove the human element from revelation. That anytime there is communication from the divine, and that communication is clothed in language, something will always be lost in that sort of translation. I mean, it's a translation, essentially.
Sure.
Communication with God comes as a flow of pure intelligence. It doesn't come as a teletype. The Doctrine and Covenants, the words are not the revelation. The words are an attempt to clothe the revelation in language. And I believe Joseph Smith received a revelation about sealing the entire human family together in a beautiful and wonderful way. And that revelation is clothed in language in Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, alongside what I believe to be Joseph's not necessarily misinterpretation, but the human elements of Joseph Smith coming to bear in there, that Joseph Smith felt that the best way to do that was through this kind of, I've always found it interesting, for instance, that sealings to parents and temple sealings that aren't a marriage sealing did not happen in Joseph Smith's lifetime, that was not something that Joseph Smith envisioned. And so getting this pure intelligence that we all need to be sealed together as a family, and Joseph Smith took that and thought, well, then we've got to, everybody needs to get married. There needs to be this polygamous. I mean, that's how I sort of wrestle with polygamy, is that I think there is a core beautiful doctrine there that to some degree went awry.
Okay.
So when you ask me, is section 132, and see this gets back to the whole black and white. I mean, if you're going to make me say a black and white answer to it, you're going to make me presuppose that revelation. I do not believe that the words in section 132 were handed to Joseph Smith in the same way somebody would hand a document to somebody else and say, this is something I have written. But I don't believe that any scripture functions that way.
Okay. So, and I have several things I would push back on. I mean, first of all, Joseph did institute adoptions, right? And sealings aren't best understood through Joseph's own words as marriages. But I mean, that was a part of it. But when he talked about sealing,
there weren't any sealings of parent to child until after Joseph Smith's death.
Do you mean, okay, well, I guess I'd have to understand what you mean, because adoptions very much was something that the later leaders were trying to understand what Joseph was doing with that, which would be a parent-child sealing. But I think you just, anyway, that's something we could talk about, because I just have been looking at the Nauvoo temple records, and that was after Joseph's death, but it was in the Nauvoo temple, and they were sealing children to parents, not just the adoption doctrine.
But after Joseph's death.
After Joseph's death, yes. But do you have in mind any other revelation from Joseph Smith that needs that same set of caveats that you just applied to Section 132? Because
I think every revelation of Joseph needs.
What other sections of the Doctrine and Covenants do you feel like that is atrocious? That is horrible.
That's the caveat.
No, I'm just wondering, because that's, I guess, and kind of the question I'm wondering is like, so just so you know, we are in complete agreement on Section 132. That is exactly what I think the historical record shows, is that Joseph revealed some glorious doctrine that was added to. That's how it looks to me.
So you think the first part of the section was written by Joseph and the second part was written
not by verse 1. I think verse 1 is horrible. But we have a lot of testimony that Joseph did receive a revelation on eternal marriage and opposed polygamy, and he taught publicly eternal marriage, just as he said he did. And then I think later on we got the polygamist parts added to it, because we didn't get Section 132 until 1852, well into Utah, when Brigham pulled it out of his desk and said that that's where he had it that entire time, and nobody knew about it. I don't know if you know the history of Section 132, or that we had the original statement on marriage in the Doctrine and Covenants. All of the Doctrine and Covenants that were, both versions of the Doctrine and Covenants that were published during Joseph Smith's lifetime had a very anti-polygamy section on marriage in them. That was actually in our scriptures until the year before Brigham Young died, when that section was removed and 132 was added. And so most people don't know that 132 wasn't added to the Doctrine and Covenants until 1876. And it was more broadly published and distributed in 1880. And so that's why I guess I'm asking, because the church went through that many years. Actually, all of the polygamous years, they didn't have Section 132 in the scriptures. So it's kind of been interesting to me to consider what I would think would be the ideal scenario to see happen with Section 132. Should we have canonized threats of destruction to women who won't go along with the law of Sarah, or whatever we might have it be? Should we have canonized this doctrine of virgins being given and treated as commodities that are used as rewards and punishments for men with no thoughts of their own? Is that of God, and should that be part of our canonized scriptures in your opinion?
Again, it comes back to what I consider the nature of Scripture to be. I don't think removing the historical record is productive. I think one of the things that is so beautiful about our church and about our faith, and something that we run away from, is that we are a church built on the idea of continuing revelation. And we are built, yet we run away from that because we insist that things that are canonized are somehow infallible and can never, ever, 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 ever change. And it's always bizarre to me that a church built on continuing revelation is also a church that is so rigid to insist that nothing can change. And much has changed, and yet when it does change, it also comes with this sort of caveat of, well, this was never really revelation to begin with. Mm. This was never doctrine. I mean, the word doctrine.
It's such a tricky word.
It's not. It's largely a useless word, because the way it is used is nothing can change, and doctrine can't change. Unchangeable doctrine, and then it changes.
And then it was just a practice. Then it becomes a practice.
And then retroactively we change what it was, and to me, that is a fruitless exercise, not just on Section 132. I mean, there are sections of the Book of Mormon that are absolutely atrocious, particularly 2 Nephi chapter 5, verse 21, that talks about the skin of darkness and blackness, which continues to follow us, and has we're not willing to say somebody made a mistake there. I mean, I think Nephi made the mistake I think Nephi, I don't think that was necessarily a Joseph Smith mistake. I think Nephi made the mistake in terms of trying to otherize the Lamanites and build community among the Nephites as they were in this new world and trying to survive.
So just I'll recommend to you Marvin Perkins. I think he's done the best work on that of anybody I know, and I actually love his work. He's brought forward some brilliant things on it. Have you looked into his work?
I have not. I'm a big fan of Paul Reeves' work on that. But
well, I like Paul Reeves too, but just specifically on the Book of Mormon, the Old Testament idioms, because it talks about a skin of blackness in Job, and I like his work on that.
Yeah, to me, that's just trying to retroactively pretend that mistake didn't happen.
I see it very differently. Okay.
I don't see any history of the church where that verse did not mean exactly what it said it meant. The idea that now all of a sudden, we just never noticed that this was just some kind of idiomatic expression and had nothing to do with actual skin color.
I don't think that's what he's saying. I think
I don't know his work, and I can't comment necessarily on his work. But from a broader perspective, I think the healthier and more productive way to deal with errors in our doctrine and errors in our history is to seek further light and knowledge.
I agree.
And accept and recognize the error, but not necessarily expunge the idea that it never happened.
Okay.
So the idea of pretending that Section 132 doesn't say what it says or wasn't ever really revelation, and to try and just to sort of excise it from the record.
That's not my
unproductive.
Yeah. Okay. Just and we can let it go, but that's not my perspective at all. That we should excise it from the record or try to hide our history. I struggle that we have these things that, like the Book of Mormon, very clearly calls abomination, and we have them. We just have this section of scripture that makes so many claims that run counter to all of our other scriptures. So I think it's unfortunate that we have it as canonized scripture, because even though I appreciate your view on scripture, and I share it to a large degree. Like we talk about the Bible, that it's descriptive, not proscriptive, right? It's not telling us what we should do. It's helping us to see consequences of various actions, and we have different ways of viewing it. But yeah, I do think that it's interesting how you talk about changing the historical record, because the pre-1876 Doctrine and Covenants was incredibly different than the post-1876 Doctrine and Covenants. It contained the lectures on faith, and it contained the statement on marriage, and and then it had a lot of things added to it. So I think we do have an open canon, and I appreciate that. And I would like to see us personally. I would like to see us, receive further light and knowledge on this topic, and be open to considering whether ideas that are just not of God should be canonized as revelation in our scriptures. That's my perspective on it, but maybe you see it differently.
No, well, I don't think you should stop having this discussion with as many people as want to have it with you. Again, I didn't come here to defend Joseph Smith's polygamy.
Yeah.
I still believe Joseph Smith was a polygamist. I respect that you don't, and that you have good reasons for not believing that. And I recognize the weakness of history in that it's often very difficult to pin down exactly what happened. At its base, though, I think that either Joseph was a polygamist or he wasn't. And whether or not we can know that through history is to some degree secondary to the fact that that ultimately is a reality that may be unknowable, but I think that the preponderance of evidence suggests that he was.
Well, I appreciate you coming to have the conversation. I hope you don't feel like I made you. I don't think that we did have the debate about whether Joseph was or wasn't a polygamist, because I didn't bring up a single piece of evidence. I think the question was more, is there room for this conversation without people thinking that it's already settled? That's more the conversation I'm trying to have with people. But
So in the context of what we've been talking about and where we began, as we sort of conclude and where we're ending, the question as to whether or not a historical question is settled is ultimately an academic question. There are very few academic disciplines or ideas where, when people talk about facts and history, they'll say, most historians believe, but you will always be able to find a contrarian, including, you'll be able to find respected contrarians. And sometimes, not always, and I probably would say not the majority of times, but sometimes those contrarians turn out to be right, and everybody else turns out to be wrong, and historical thinking shifts. And so that's entirely appropriate to be raising those kinds of questions in a kind of historical setting. Where we began and where I think we're finishing here is it appropriate for Latter-day Saints to be having these kinds of discussions and still be considered a part of the body of saints? Do you need to be excised from the body of saints because you have persistent interest in this issue and persistent questions on this issue, and do not accept the church's essentially established position on the issue? And from my perspective, I absolutely think you should be able to continue to do that within the boundaries of the church. I don't think anything that you are raising here should in any way call into question your discipleship, your willingness to be able to be numbered among the body of saints. If you were out there advocating adultery and advocating bank robbing or then maybe I might revisit that. But from my perspective, and I'm just one guy, but from my perspective, I think that there, I've said many times that where I found the boundaries of the church to be is it's a twofold proposition. The first part is that the tolerance in the church for a wide variety of opinion is much broader than people realize, I think.
Okay.
But the flip side to that is that the tolerance for any criticism of church leaders is much lower than people realize. And I think where you might end up getting into trouble, or maybe have gotten into trouble, is when you name names about church leaders, when you start saying, well, Brigham Young did this wrong. Mm-hmm. That's where you're going to get pushback. You're not going to get pushback from me, because I don't see how that's healthy and productive. But I also see that that's where the boundary is. So I will always be careful and cautious in terms of when I start talking about any frustration I have with the church, not limited to this issue, but limited to any issue. The minute I start saying, well, Elder so-and-so is any degree of, if I start saying Elder so-and-so wears ugly ties, I'm in more danger of getting into trouble than I am if I start expressing a heretical doctrinal opinion.
So that's interesting because, so with your CES letter, you mentioned how the church can't say that anybody ever made a mistake. So the middle ground that you have found is you can just say that kind of the amorphous they can make mistakes, but you can't point out it with any specificity.
It's interesting because the longer somebody's been dead, so the church is now fairly comfortable admitting that Brigham Young was a racist. And in fact, Paul Reeve was asked to write a book called Let's Talk About Race and the Priesthood for Deseret Book. And he said, I'm not going to write this if you won't let me say that the priesthood ban was a mistake.
Right. And
they let him write it. And it's a wonderful book, and I commend it to everyone. But so the church, we're taking very small baby steps in this direction. I mean, you read the Race and the Priesthood essay, and it comes right up to the line
Yeah.
saying this was a mistake, but it's not willing to cross over it. So yeah, I mean, with my CES letter reply, the thing is, it's also a matter of framing it, because very often, and I think what the church is afraid of is that very often when you start going down the road and say, okay, well, Brigham Young was a racist and he made this terrible mistake, the natural next step on that is to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Right.
Well, if Brigham Young was a racist and Brigham Young instituted a mistaken priesthood ban, then he couldn't possibly have been a prophet. And everything noteworthy or positive or inspired, or that I thought was inspired, that all has to go out the window too. It becomes an all or nothing proposition, when in fact every human being, including every church leader, is a mix of strengths and weaknesses, is a mix of good and evil. Brigham Young, in my opinion, had exactly the talents and skills the Lord needed to hold the church together after Joseph Smith's assassination and lead us to Utah and create us as a people that and I am tremendously grateful for him for that, and believe him to be a prophet of God for that. And I also believe, as a prophet of God, he was also capable of being a racist and of perpetuating a common Protestant justification for slavery in the form of the idea that black people bear the curse of Cain. I mean, he didn't invent that. He incorporated that from the larger landscape, and we've suffered the consequences as a result. But it's the same with Joseph Smith. It's the same with every church leader, is that I believe God uses all of us to try to build the kingdom, and that our weaknesses and our failings end up becoming stumbling blocks until we can accept the fact that you can make mistakes, even big mistakes, and still be an instrument in the hands of God.
Okay. That's a good perspective. And we probably need to end it. I have so many things I want to respond to, but I do appreciate you sharing your view. I think it'll be interesting to see how people respond to this conversation, because I think it's, anyway, a lot to talk about. I will just mention this. I do think the question of prophets is a worthy one to explore and to investigate, right? We have big P prophet, little p prophet. What does it mean, right? I personally like to differentiate between president of the church, which I absolutely sustain. I don't necessarily think that we understand prophet in the best way to say that those are equated always and only. The only prophet is the president of the church, and the president of the church is always a prophet. But so I should probably throw that in there. But I view it as, it doesn't negate what God has done through this restoration, through this people, through this church, through this gospel. We get taught a lot in Jacob chapter 5, I think, the branches and the roots, and all of us need to do that hard work always of discerning truth from error. And that's our challenge, to try to keep as much baby as possible and get rid of as much bathwater as possible, so that our testimonies are founded on as much rock as possible with as little sand, right? Isn't that the goal? And
I think that's the goal.
Yeah, that's how I view our challenge, wherever the challenge may be, because so many people say the same thing. If Joseph Smith did those things, he can't have been a prophet. I'm throwing it out. If Brigham Young did those things, he can't have been a prophet. I'm throwing it out. And I prefer, rather than having my testimony based on a person, to say, what is it I'm throwing out? What is the core, and what is the value here? And is it possible that, I don't know, I really like the scripture, no unhallowed hand can stop this work from progressing, even if those unhallowed hands sometimes are people in leadership in the church, right? We don't need to let it separate us from the gospel and from the church. That's my perspective. But thank you for the conversation, and I will look forward to talking again.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for inviting me.
I want to sincerely thank Jim for coming on and for sticking it out. I'm sure that at points in this conversation, he felt at least as frustrated as I did, and maybe more, but I thought it was really valuable. I'm thankful to all of you who stuck it out through our adventure going to the library, all of the craziness. But again, I think that this hopefully demonstrated the importance of even difficult conversations. I am thankful that we did this and that we were able to have such a fantastic conversation the next day. That link will be in the description box. I hope you enjoyed that episode, and I will see you next time.